Right, thank you also for inviting me, and I'll see if I can do my best to follow up on that excellent presentation we just heard. This, of course, is something that's very related to what Stefan just told us. What our focus here is mainly Denmark, and it's not that much. This is a microeconomic study, so I'm not going to talk that much about the actual contribution to growth in the way that Stefan did. Right, so the title of my talk here is going to be Measurement of Effects of Standards Purchases by Danish Firms. And I should say right away, because that's kind of something I'm also going to talk a little bit about, that this is something that we did as a consultancy report for what is called in Denmark Erhvervs- og Byggestyrelsen. It's the Danish agency for this area, which is also what Danish Standards is connected to. And this means that we have not used probably the most sophisticated econometric techniques that we could have done, but we have done it to say this in a way to make them the data more presentable. Right, so what I'm going to say is I'm going to give you a brief introduction. Some of the things that I say in the introduction has Stefan already touched upon, so I'm going to skip that quite fast. Then I'm going to talk a little about the data sources that we have for this study. We have micro level data from Statistic Denmark and from Danish Standards. Then I'm going to show you some descriptive statistics of this, sort of what are the types of firms that buy standards from Danish Standards, and what industries are they in, and do they export, etc. Then we are going to show you the statistical analysis. This is where we have done only linear regressions. There are a whole bunch of econometric, more advanced techniques that could be used, but this is done linear regression as sort of as a first step to sort of establish a statistical relationship between these areas, and then we want to move on, preferably to do even more sophisticated analysis. And finally, I'm going to say a little bit in the end to wrap it all up. Okay. Where do I come from? I come from a place which is called CBR, which is a combined research and analysis center at the Copenhagen Business School. As I said, we carry out economic analysis on a consultancy basis, mainly for government agencies, industry groups, and foundations in Denmark. We also do research, economic research, externally financed in various areas. We are mainly business economists, but we also do labor market and social areas, and we are all the sort of economists, and we have a PhD in economics, so our point of view is purely economic on this. We have no sort of knowledge of the actual, how do firms actually implement standards in firms, so how do standards even come about, and all this work in the standardization committees. I've worked a lot with this area for some years now, so of course I've heard of something about how this also boils down into actually the physical standard. And even when I was writing this, the previous report here, I was sort of saying, okay, probably this is how people buy standards. They go into a Danish Standards website, and they're going to make a whole lot of clicks and use their Visa card, and then they buy a standard. And then people told me that, okay, that's not how they do it. Most standards are still sold as a paper. So okay, I changed the text, and this just as an illustration of that. I actually don't know that much about the standards itself, but I know something about sort of the impact into the economic world. Okay, so the analysis presented here is a microeconomic follow-up on the macroeconomic one that we did in 2007, which was the one that Stefan referred to just before, which says that standard may be able to explain between 4 and 11% of residual growth after having control for the growth in labor and capital. So it's exactly the same type of analysis that Stefan showed us, which is the growth accounting exercise on industry data on Danish data. And as Stefan also said, these are not statistically significant, only in some industries. So okay, but that's all I'm going to say about this. So this is a totally different analysis. The theoretical background, which was also what Stefan told us, is that sort of there are sort of more these 4 different types of standards, and I'm not going to tell you a lot about this because basically Stefan already told us a lot about it, and the main point here is also the one that Stefan gave us, namely that sort of from a theoretical point of view, standards can have both negative and positive effects on growth and economic working in workplaces and in firms. So it all comes down to an empirical analysis to tell us, well, is this actually a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there's a lot of good arguments that this should be a good thing. Especially, I think, seen at least from my point of view, this facilitating trade argument is probably the best argument, that firms in Italy and in Denmark can easily sign up a contract because they can refer to the same standard, and they can easily agree upon which sort of part they should produce for the firm. And this is most definitely a very good thing in terms of the trade. Okay. Data sources for this product. There are mainly two sources here. One of them is that we got a database covering sales data from the Danish standards, which was from 1993 onwards. And these sales data contained basically three types of information. The first is the firm registration number. That's what we in Denmark call a CVR number. The second is the date of the sale, and the third is the type of the sale, whether it is one standard or more standards, or whether it's part of an ongoing updating standards, so anything. Anyway, what we do is we're going to sort of treat all sales as one type. We don't look into different types here. So basically, we just say that a sale, have you purchased something from Danish standards, then we will sort of use the terminology that you have purchased a standard. Okay. The second, sort of we combine this database from Danish standards with registered data from Statistics Denmark on Danish firms. These data also contain the firm registration number, which means that we can merge the two data sets. And we have accounting data for value-added employment, equity, etc. for different firms. And we have background data also for firms. That's the geographical location, which industry they are in. And we have some knowledge about the employees and the firms. So all this means that we can carry out a statistical analysis on this area. Okay. Now I'm just going to show you some pure descriptive statistics on this data. Let's see. No. There we are. Okay, so this table shows the share of firms having bought standards according to this definition that I just told you. That if you have a record in this sales database that you have bought something from Danish standards in the year 2005, then you have been registered as having purchased a standard. So we don't differentiate between the different types, we just say that you have purchased a standard. So that's basically for data convenience, that we believe that this is a very good approximation for the thing that we actually want to measure. Namely that you have purchased a standard. Most of the records are simple purchases of standards. Okay, so firms between 0 and 9 employees, only 0.5% of these actually bought a standard in 2004, 5, 6, or 7. So what we can see here is that as firms get bigger, they are a lot more likely to have purchased a standard during one of these years. So for employees more than 250, almost half of them purchased something from Danish standards every year of these 2 to 3 years. So larger firms are much more likely to be customers with Danish standards than smaller firms.
Just a clarifying question, you took out everything that was not firms, right?
Sorry?
You took out all organizations and so on that were not firms, private firms? Or
No, this is everyone. These are just everybody who have a CVR number. So this is also public administration. Everything that could be that's registered.
not necessarily firms.
No, they're not necessarily private firms in that sense. No, but of course most of them are. But they are because public administration universities, etc. That's only a very small amount, and this is just counting. So we basically, each firm just count once. So whether you are AP Møller or whether you are a small builder in a village outside Odense, you just count it once. Okay, so this shows that specific industries are more likely to purchase standards than others. So this tells us something about this is the distribution of sales in a specific year. I think it was 2005. I have to check it out. I think it was 2005. Okay, so this does not add up to 100, but it's to 100%. But this is because I've only chosen some industries. We work with 27 different industries, so these are only sort of how many? 7 of them. So we can see. So if you had all 27, both of these columns would add up to 100%. So what we can see here is the share of standards sold, the share of records sold in 2005 that goes to the different industries, and this is the share of employees in the same year. So okay, so we can see here that 27% of all employees are in public administration, but only 3.6% of standards were sold to public administration. Okay, and again, as you can see here, the same thing. Very big differences in the distribution of how firms are buying standards. We can see that in metal industry and construction and wholesale industry, there's a lot larger share probability of buying standards than sort of some industries use standards a lot more than other industries. It's basically what we can see from this picture here. Specifically in manufacturing and in services. Okay.
What is business services?
That's basically most service industries. That's the consultancies, and it's also retailers, shops, etc. So this is sort of to underline my point about the fact that standards facilitates trade. This table shows the probability that a firm, sort of the share of firms in an industry which have bought standards. So this is the share of non-exporting firms within the industry that bought standards in 2005, and this is the share of exporting firms. So what we can see here is that exporting firms are much more likely to have bought standards in construction, even in construction, which is not that big of an exporting sector. Only 3.7% of non-exporting firms, but 17.9% of exporting firms bought a standard from Danish standards. Okay, and these numbers are much bigger in other areas like chemical and plastics industry. That's more than 45% of each of the firms who were exporters in 2005, which also bought the standards in that year. So this sort of, at least in my view, underlines this whole idea that standards is a very big part in facilitating trade. What we of course we should be aware of here is that this picture here is skewed because there's a lot of small firms over here and there's a lot of big firms over here, because it's mainly big firms that are exporters. So this also is, this was exactly what we saw in one of the previous, sorry, it's the wrong way. Here, right? So we can already in this table we saw that big firms are much more likely to purchase standards than small firms. So this is probably something of the same thing that we see here, namely because big firms are much more likely to be exporters than small firms. Okay, the final division here that I'm going to show you in the descriptive statistics part is that between Danish and international standards. This division that we did here between Danish and international standards is not entirely completely correct, because what we did, we took a name search on the standards, and when those who started with ISU and EN, and so all of these standard names that come from international institutions, we define them as international. And all those that started with DS and something else, I don't remember exactly the details, we define them as Danish standards. So this basically shows the share of firms in each industry that has bought a Danish standard, or the share of firms that has bought an international standard. So what we can see here is that, as we also, this comes back also to the fact that the standards facilitate trade, most of them are international standards, and this is also very related to what we have seen all morning, with the fact that this harmonization of standards through the new approach is that most standards are international and most standards come in some EU relation. Okay, so the only really difference to this conclusion is the building and construction sector, where we can see that the share that bought Danish standards is actually larger than the share that bought international standards. And this is also very much in line with the fact that building standards are often much more national, coming back to the example with the plots that we had this morning. Okay. So to sum up this section, firms purchasing standards from Danish standards are much larger than average. They are more likely to be from manufacturing than the average firm is, and they are more likely to be exporters than non-exporters, and they are more likely to purchase international standards than Danish standards compared to average. So as I've been saying, to me these conclusions sort of seems to support the conclusion that the use of standards facilitates international trade. Okay, now we're going to move over to the statistical analysis. So this descriptive statistics underlines the necessity to carry out a formal statistical analysis to correctly measure whether standards are associated with higher value added, etc. Because if we compare the firms that have bought standards with firms that haven't bought standards, then we would sort of have to, the daily difference in outcome could be related to their size, because what we saw was that bigger firms were much more likely to buy standards, or they could be related to the fact that they come from certain industries, or they could be related to the fact that they use more or less labor input or any other inputs. So what we have done here is that we've used only what's called ordinary least squares regressions. As I said, this means that what we find here is that these statistical relationships cannot be said to be causal. So further investigation will have to confirm whether these relationships are actually causal. But we are hoping that we could do that in the future. We worked also on a matching design where we used propensity score matching instead to identify control groups. These basically, well, it was very interesting, but there was large standard errors on the estimates, so we were afraid that sort of the conclusion were really hard to find in that analysis. So we sort of decided this one, because also for the presentation it would be nice to have something that was more statistically safe or certain. Standards in this analysis enter into the analysis via only one binary variable, which this binary variable has the value of 1 if the firm had purchased a standard in the year of analysis or in any year of the 5 years preceding this year. Because it means that if we look, for instance, say at 2005, then so a firm has a 1 in this standards variable if they purchased the standards in 2005, or any of the years, any of the 5 years preceding that. That means from 1999 rather to 2004. Okay. So if the firm has purchased a standard in any years before that, then we sort of say that the effect is 0. So basically we say that if they haven't purchased a standard, if they purchased a standard say 7 years ago, and they haven't purchased any standards in the years up to the analysis year, then we say the effect is 0, because we basically say that maybe the standard is too old, or if they haven't followed up on it, then it's probably the effect has been depreciated or whatever. Basically, this just say that this analysis allows us to say, okay, the standards are not entirely depreciated in a single year, but rather they are valid for some years, but they're not valid throughout eternity. So anyway, this is not very big of a problem because many of the firms that buy standards actually buy them often, and updates are also in this case counted as a purchase. So if you have bought a standard and you in a later year buy an update to this standard, that's also counted as a new purchase, so that you are counted again. So this is basically what I just said before, namely that it's not realistic that only standards purchased during the present year should influence production, and it's also not realistic that standards purchased in 10 or more years ago maybe should continue to have any significant effect, rather than due to depreciation of knowledge, etc. Hence, we choose a compromise sort of 5 years. But I should also say that there's no depreciation over these 5 years. So any standard that we purchased 5 years ago is assumed to count exactly in the same way as the standard we purchased this year. Okay, so these are the results for value added in Danish firms. So we carry out it for a number of different years, and we sort of, this is, I'm not going to tell you much about the details here, but I show the numbers in bold are statistically significant at the 5% level. And the yeses here means that we have, in addition to controlling for these variables up here, we have also control for the geographical location within Denmark, and we have control for which industry the firms belong to, of the 27 industries that I mentioned before. Okay, so we can see here standards have a significant positive statistical relationship with value added, and as we expect, of course, we have controlled for assets and we have controlled for the number of employees, and they also, of course, have a very large statistic relationship. We have also had control for patenting. Firms that have taken out a patent have a higher value added, and whether if you are a new firm, you have a significantly lower value added. Right. The same here for export revenue. We can see that here also the standard variable, which is on the top row, has a clear, significant positive influence. The same, so with this, we have control for approximately the same variables here. Okay, this sums up the whole analysis, the different areas that we have looked at. The pluses means that there is a significant positive effect, the minuses means there's a significant negative effect, and 0 means that the effect is insignificant. So we can see that basically there's a lot of pluses here, so that the firms that have purchased standards are statistically associated with higher value added and higher number of employees, and higher export revenue and higher total factor productivity. So this is basically also, to say it again, the firm's purchase of standards is associated, sort of using this simple linear regression analysis, that they have higher value added, they have more employees, higher export revenue and higher productivity than other comparable firms, having control for the use of labor and having control for total assets and having control for geographical location and having control for the industry that they are in. There are probably a lot of other things we could control for here. For instance, one of the things that it could be nice to control for is sort of the quality of labor used in this. We have used the number of employees only. Okay, so to discuss this, one of the things that I want to work on with this type of data is, okay, the data set here may actually be quite noisy, because what we have here is that we have only registered the firms who have actually purchased a standard from Danish standards. So we have no knowledge of whether they've actually implemented this standard. So okay, so maybe they have just bought the standard, they have looked on it and say, okay, this is probably not something that we were going to go into. That will still be counted as a purchase in our study, and it will not actually be fair to assume that this firm should have any impact of purchasing to this standard. Okay. And why is this actually so relevant? It is because implementations involves a significantly higher cost than just purchasing the standard. Purchasing the standard is not a very high cost, but implementation is going to be a very large cost because you have to maybe change your whole organization, change production processes, etc. And that's going to be costly to a large degree. So it's fair to say that, okay, if a firm actually, it will do some sort of investment calculation saying, okay, we have the standard, and they're going to say, okay, look at it as an investment. If we make a firm investment here and say, you are going to invest all this time to implement it, and then we're probably going to get some return on this investment over some years. And for some firms, that's not going to be a very good investment, and they're going to choose not to do it, and therefore will not implement the standard. So basically, it could be nice to have more knowledge about which firms actually implement this standard, or rather than just buying it, and what are their motivations for implementing it. Nevertheless, also there's a clear statistical relationship in this simple analysis between the purchase of standards and the number of economic success variables. However, we should do a lot more work to be able to be sure of the causality and whether implementation is actually measured in a very good way by just registering the purchases of standards. Okay. Thank you for your attention.